I'm here with Haley Rawl, and today we're talking about the Mormon beauty standard. We're going to get into Botox, boob jobs, blondness, thinness, the entire spectrum of what it means to grow up in the church as a woman and have all these messages. So Haley, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. I'm so excited to be here, and I love this topic. I think it's endlessly fascinating. So I'm excited to talk about it with you.
And Haley has an amazing podcast. It's called Girls Camp. It's a great podcast to listen to for anybody who's leaving the Mormon church or kind of going through a faith transition. She has a lot of amazing episodes. I'll put that below. But Haley, if you could just start with sharing your kind of upbringing in the Mormon church.
Yeah, of course. I grew up in Provo, Utah. So pretty much the most Mormon place probably in the world. And I did all of the Mormon things. I ended up going on a mission. I went to Berlin, Germany. I got married in the temple, the Mormon temple. And yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I would say just a pretty typical Mormon life path. I will say, I think interesting to note is that my parents got divorced when I was 13, and my dad experienced drug addiction and alcoholism for most of my childhood and adolescence. So I do think that that added a bit of a different flavor as far as my experience with Mormonism, because it wasn't entirely typical. Like, we didn't have that family unit that Mormonism loves to talk about. And I felt a little bit other in that sense. But beyond that, I would say it was just being a Mormon girl growing up in Utah.
And how did growing up in Utah, do you think, shape your perception of beauty standards?
Probably so much more than I can even know, because I have lived outside of Utah. I went on my mission in Germany, as I mentioned, and I also lived in San Francisco. We lived there for about 2 years, my husband and I, right out of school. But other than that, I've been in Utah my whole life. So, it's kind of difficult sometimes to tell. I don't know any different. I don't know anything to compare it to. But I do know that the beauty standards here seem pretty intense. And I think the older I get, the more I realize how intense the expectation of beauty was and what a number it did on me and my psyche. And kind of just as I've become more exposed to people outside of this community and just more self-aware and thinking more critically about things, I'm realizing that yes, there's society beauty standards, and then there's Mormon beauty standards, and then there's Utah Mormon beauty standards. And I was kind of right in the middle of that.
Could you describe, from your definition, what is the kind of Mormon beauty standard for women?
Yeah, great question. I would say thin for sure. I think that Utah also has a really high emphasis on fitness. So thin and even toned beyond just thin. You want to appear very healthy, well-dressed, well-groomed, a lot of attention put into the way that you present yourself. So I think it's probably less common for women to go out and about without makeup on and without their hair done and an outfit put together. White, blonde. The blonde thing is, I still think blonde is probably predominantly the beauty standard here as well.
And growing up with all of this, I mean, you just listed a lot of things, and we didn't even we're going to get into modesty too. Growing up, seeing this around you, how do you feel like you were stacking yourself up against the standard that was seen as what you're supposed to look like?
It's an interesting question, and I've thought about this a lot when I talk about beauty standards, because I'm petite, I'm 5'3", and I've always been naturally somewhat thin. And so I think that alone, because I just genetically was more thin, probably prevented me from feeling as much friction as I would have otherwise. That said, as early as middle school, maybe even late elementary school, I remember thinking a lot about my body and thinking about the food I was eating and how that was going to affect my body and my weight, and just being really tuned in to that piece of things. And I think that's such a big part of it, because there's beauty standards, like, how you look. But then when you talk about body image, it feels like it impacts your life even more, because then you're also talking about food, you're talking about exercise, all those things. So I feel like it was just ever present for me. As far back as I can remember, I remember thinking a lot about how I looked and what I wore and how I presented myself. I can't really remember a time where that wasn't something that I was pretty actively thinking about.
Yeah, I found a little illustration that I did in my journal. I illustrated all of my family members, including myself. And I have one arrow, I'm pointing to my hair, describing it, but one arrow where I say, I'm very thin. And then I wrote off to the side, like, later, of course I would never be fat, or like some other, I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically like, I was very proud that I was not overweight.
Yes.
And I feel like, I also have memories of being measured at the bust and the waist and the butt and seeing if this is the measurement of the perfect body. And I think that even though I was blonde, I still was not quite, and I didn't grow up in Utah, but I think even if you are getting maybe 3 of the 5 things, you still hyperfixate on the 2.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one big thing I remember, my teeth. I have a gap in my teeth still, but I had a very big gap in my teeth. And I also have this mole, making sure I was doing it on the right side, which those are now 2 of like my very favorite things about myself, which is special to say because so much time and energy was spent as a kid and also into high school. I remember just being so mortified that I had a gap in my teeth and that I had a mole. Like, it was just so embarrassing to me. I think it also ties in a lot to wealth. My family couldn't afford to get me braces and I didn't have enough of like a need for them. And I remember thinking like, oh, my friends can afford to get braces, so they have these beautiful, perfect teeth and I can't afford that. And so now I have these embarrassing teeth because I couldn't afford to get braces or to whiten my teeth or all these other things that also cost money. And as early on as, middle school, there were people around me actively spending money on like improving their appearance.
Yeah, I met people at BYU who had already had nose jobs, and I was kind of like, why are college students, my family also didn't have enough money for that kind of a thing. And so it felt like, how does your family even first have the money, but then have the interest in pursuing something like this?
Yes, I know multiple girls from my high school who were gifted as a graduation gift boob jobs right out of high school.
Wow.
Which is really crazy because we'll talk about my boob job. I just got one at age 29. And even that, I was like, I was glad I was the age that I am to be able to really think through the risks, the potential complications, and also just to make a somewhat permanent decision about my body. Who knows, like, what size I would have done when I was 18 or whatever, just because that's very young. Your brain is not even fully developed yet. But on top of that, of course, just having like a parent offer that as a gift of like, I'll pay for your boob job, honey, when you graduate. It's really wild to think about even being a teenage girl and having like your parent offer that as if that's like something that you really need
or is desirable.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting you mentioned, we have societal beauty standards, Mormon beauty standards, and Utah Mormon beauty standards. And why do you think, what is behind the phenomenon of whether it's body modification, dyeing hair, anything that is really going into this ideal Mormon woman? Why do you think that is so loud, so big in Mormonism and Utah?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and I think it's multifaceted. But the first thing that comes to mind is that it is women's way, women who are disempowered in the Mormon system. It is their way to appeal to power or to get close to power. And I remember, not in any super conscious way, but I remember internalizing that slowly over time and realizing that men are in charge, but if I'm attractive to men, that puts me in closer proximity to the power and the authority. And just, of course, in a ultra patriarchal system, the greatest thing you can do is receive attention and validation from men. So I think that aspect of things, which very much exists outside of Mormonism and outside of Utah, is really heightened in Utah Mormonism. And because in Utah, so many people are Mormon, or there's enough of a Mormon majority that even if you're not part of that, it still kind of spills over, because there's also the phenomenon of if your neighbor is getting Botox and a boob job and highlights, then that's who you're comparing to. So I think there's just enough women here with that mindset that it kind of like spills over to everybody.
Yeah, in my book, somebody that I know that's ex-Mormon wrote a story for my book about how he is some Polynesian and some Irish as part of his heritage, and how his seminary teacher, I believe it was, would call him sheep, or maybe it was his bishop, like, because he had curly hair, and he would call him Harry, you're a sheep, or, just call him names. And how he stopped wearing shorts even because he was embarrassed that his calves were big compared to like the skinny, tall runner boy that is most Mormon men. And and I think even, obviously that's both racist and derogatory. And I think that also shifts over to women too. I think I've also heard stories of, any woman of color coming into this culture where whiteness is so highly valued, and knowing that me as a white blonde girl that was mostly thin was still hyper aware of my body.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of just mostly part of the stereotype and still kind of hating myself. I can only imagine anyone who's only one of the 5 things feeling incredibly dismissed and devalued by this system that really rewards. I love what you said. If you're closer to the ideal, you have more value here. You have more proximity to people of power and people with authority and money.
Yes, and it's so sad. I mean, thinking about the race element of things too, I've heard from, I think maybe just seeing things on TikTok and stuff, but of women of color talking about dating in Utah and what an absolute shit show that is. I'm sure we can only imagine. And to your point, I think it's really important to continually reiterate how much more difficult that experience would be as a person of color in also such a predominantly white state and religion. Growing up, I always had ideas and thoughts and opinions. Surprise, surprise, as a human does. And I remember thinking that to get people to pay attention to me, my thoughts, my ideas, my opinions, I had to have some sort of beautiful something to get them to pay attention in the first place. And you just think about how sad that is, and also how much these cultures are missing out on by way of just women's participation, because they're mostly prioritizing who they listen to based on appearance.
Somebody I know basically had an MBA from Harvard. She's a woman in finance, and she can't be the ward clerk. She can't crunch the smallest number in a church because she's a woman.
Yep.
And same with, whatever, if it's a doctor, a pediatrician, anyone that could say, hey, I have this part of myself that could be really helpful to this community. And they're completely disinterested if it doesn't fall within the realm of one of the callings that the church has kind of invented for members. So it's crazy that there are people, women with ideas and with high level abilities with PhDs, that they won't let them use their skill to bless their community because they're women.
Yeah. And the communities suffer greatly for it.
They're like, sorry, can you just be pretty, please? That's really all we're after.
Be pretty and coordinate the meal, And those things I think are really intertwined too when we're thinking about homemaking and a woman's role within Mormonism. I think that women who feel limited or put in a box with a role, maybe someone doesn't want to be a stay-at-home mom, but they feel like that's what they need to do, or that's what their husband and the church community encourages them to do. I also think that puts an additional pressure on that person, because appearance is at least something somewhat within their control. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think also if you don't feel self-actualized, if you're not contributing the ways that you would like to be contributing, also, quick disclaimer, not that being a stay-at-home mother is not contributing. I'm not saying that in any way, but if women feel like they would like to be contributing more than they feel like they can because of those constraints, I feel like it makes more sense that they become fixated on what they can control and get really fixated on their appearance.
Yeah, if there's only one way to succeed, then you're going to be ultra successful in that one very particular thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So if the only way you can provide value or be worthwhile is to be beautiful, then you're going to spend thousands of dollars and you're going to go to great lengths and go to every yoga class and do Pilates and get the hair extensions. And I think it's like a way to take power that you have permission to take power.
Yeah.
So it is empowering, but it's in such a small scope that it's kind of throttling a lot of your humanity at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. And it's also just a cost of energy and brain power. Like you think about the amount of time and energy that goes into appearance, it's not nothing. And that time then can't be used towards other pursuits. So it can also be very limiting in that way, because women who are really focused on that, then, you have less time to just like focus on other things that might feel better.
Yeah, especially since it is kind of, in so many cases, such a losing battle with yourself, because you can always be more beautiful. There's never a moment that you reach where you've said, okay, I finished the task of beauty and now I can move to the next task in my life.
Yeah, especially with aging. I mean,
yeah,
I'm 29, but already it's kind of interesting to notice signs of age on my face and realizing actually the task of beauty gets increasingly difficult just with age,
Yeah. And I think it's wild that Mormonism both wants women to have as many babies as possible while also erasing any evidence that you ever had babies also from your body.
Yep.
So it's this very twisted messaging where, have a ton of babies, which is incredibly difficult on your health, on your skin. I mean, the 2 times I've been pregnant, like my face gets puffy. It's really hard on your body to get pregnant. And I've had healthy pregnancies. And then to say, okay, now look like a 18-year-old again.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I think that's a huge part of your question about why it's so exacerbated in Utah, particularly if we're talking about the per capita like plastic surgeons and stuff like that, is because so many women get pregnant so young and then they experience these changes in their bodies, oftentimes things that can't really be changed without a surgical procedure. Like boobs is an example where like, you nurse and then your boobs grow and then they deflate. Or if a lot of women experience like ab separation with babies, things like that they would maybe want a tummy tuck. And so I feel like there's part of me that feels like oddly defensive of women getting plastic surgery here. And don't get me wrong, like I'm sure we'll delve into this. Like there's a lot to be said about that. But I also feel like, okay, so you're expecting these women to get married young, get pregnant young, have a bunch of babies, look beautiful, but then God forbid they get plastic surgery. But if you're having babies that young, that's why I think women, especially younger women, are getting body modifications, because they're postpartum so much earlier than women elsewhere.
Hey everybody, just jumping in really quick to let you know that my interview with Haley on Girls Camp is now live on her channel. I'll put the link below, so consider checking out that interview once you're done with this interview. I also wanted to share one other thing that's really been helping me get through my workday. Some nights I stay up really late editing and outlining, and it's been really helpful to find meals that are quick, efficient, and most of all, delicious. That's why I've been loving Factor, the sponsor of today's video. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success, and it allows you to skip grocery shopping, meal planning, and cooking fatigue. Instead, you can get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals directly to your door. There's over 35 meals to choose from each week, including vegetarian, keto, and calorie-smart options. Skip the overpriced takeout trap with Factor, who can deliver restaurant-quality meals that are delicious directly to your door. Their meals are ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes, which means more time for you. When things get hectic, Factor is also flexible, so you can change your meals to be from 4 meals up to 18 meals depending on your needs. You can also pause or reschedule your delivery at any time. Get your first Factor box 50% off with free shipping by using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. And with that, let's jump back into the interview about why so many Mormons love plastic surgery. Yeah, I have so many people who ask, why can you go under the knife, but you can't drink coffee? And it's because it is something that women do that ultimately men like. And men want women to look beautiful. And so, of course, there's not going to be any rule about, hey, no lip filler. No, it's a little dangerous, because anything that women do in pursuit of pleasing men is totally, that's okay. Whoa, yeah, please keep doing that. You want to go under the knife? We're all for that. Jesus didn't send a revelation on that.
Nope, no revelation on that. Though I will add, they also want you to look like you didn't. You know what I mean?
True.
Like there's a weird, because I get Botox, and every time I've gone in to get Botox on my forehead, I'll talk with my injector, and she says a lot of women in Utah will go get Botox with cash or their husbands don't know. Which is really
So be
interesting
natural about
because
it.
they want, obviously, to your point, like they want their wives to look beautiful, but they want that to happen naturally. And guess what? You get wrinkles when you get older. And so a lot of women, I think, I don't know how many, but some women at least are actually only getting Botox when their husbands are out of town because they want the Botox, maybe for themselves, maybe for how they're perceived, but they also don't want their husbands to know that they actually went and got Botox.
Yeah, because it's not even that you should be beautiful, it's that you should be beautiful naturally, which is just another
Just
way
another
to weigh
layer.
us down. God damn.
It never ends.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of the scene. Have you seen Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
I haven't, but I've
Okay.
heard so much about it. I should watch it.
It's in the first few episodes, but there's a scene where in Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, where she waits for her husband to fall asleep. Like they fall asleep together. She still has her makeup on her face. Once he's asleep, she runs, takes off all of her makeup, puts all her cream on, does her hair in curlers, and then goes and lays to bed, and then puts the blind up just a bit so that the sun will wake her up in the morning before her husband wakes up. And then she goes, puts her makeup back on, gets into bed, and is next to him, and he wakes up and he's like, wow, you look so nice.
Really?
And I had Mormon women in my life who said very proudly, my husband has never seen me without makeup on. Like this is an older generation,
Wow, yeah.
maybe someone from,
Yeah, but that's from once we came,
Yeah.
Like that's still, I do think it's gotten better since then, but like the fact that there's even people that were alive to tell us about that is crazy enough.
And that it's said with such pride. I think that's the other thing, is it's not kind of said as a secret or something that it's like, hey, now that it's just us women, let me let you know my husband never has seen me, and kind of in this braggy way, which goes back to the question of, who are we doing this for? If you only have one way to take power, then you are going to brag about, my husband has never even seen me with no face or no makeup on my face. You are going to brag about that because it means that you have been kind of ultimately successful. And in the same way men should have as much money as possible in the church and be professionally as successful as possible, women should be as beautiful as possible to have the highest level of value.
Yeah, absolutely.
What impact do you think that modesty culture, and we see a lot of things about garment-friendly outfits and garment checks and being modest and protecting men from our bodies because it's tempting. How do you think modesty culture impacts the beauty standard?
I recently spoke with this woman named Shannon Ricks, and I want to shout her out because she talked about, she's a therapist and she specializes in body image. And we talked a bit about modesty. And what she pointed out was so huge for me, which is that modesty requires you to become very aware of your body very early on. And so even when you're little, if your parents are like concerned about like the length of your skirt as a child, you are now thinking about your body. And you're not only thinking about your body, you're thinking about how other people are perceiving your body. And the goal ultimately is to live in your body as your own vessel for moving through life. And so to that early on, be thinking, oh, my body is something that people are noticing, they're having thoughts about, they're paying attention to. Modesty, I mean, that's the whole kind of point of modesty, ultimately, a modesty culture. And I think it just clues you in so early on that your body is something to be perceived. And then if you feel like you're being perceived all the time, then of course you want to appear the best you can possibly appear.
Yeah, I still remember when I had a member of the bishopric say that whenever girls and women showed too much skin, that men pictured them naked. And this was in an all-girl class with a female leader and one man who's doing the bishop look where he goes and looks at every single person in the room and saying, essentially, in shorthand, I picture you guys naked right now if your skirt is too short.
Yeah, like, okay, you,
yep, I'm picturing you with no clothes on. And to have an adult male come into a classroom of 14-year-olds, and the fact that also kind of that the female leader is seeing this as a good thing, that he's sharing this message with the girls, is, I think, the definition of how, as a kid, a child, you start to just, I mean, at least for me, I really hated my body, because if my body could be used for people to sin, then my body was a sin. You know, this part of my body is sinful. This part is not sinful, but it's secret. So I can't, you know, it's like there's no part of my body I'm comfortable in because it's either hidden out of shame or barely, you know, okay to be exposed because it's just my calf.
Yep.
And so it does kind of make you forever be thinking like the lengths and the widths, and, you know, also this idea, this nebulous idea of if you're showing too much skin is not even a clear enough line for me to know, so when am I naked and when am I clothed to men? So you're just
now
kind
you're
of
probably erring on the side of everyone's thinking about me naked.
Yes,
Yeah.
adult men.
Yes. Well, I feel like part of what's so complicated about all of that too, because in high school, I was nothing crazy, but I would say I was more promiscuous compared to like the standard Mormon girl. And also in what I wore. Like I was always trying to push the boundaries of modesty. And I almost had the opposite reaction to you, but with all the same shame, which is like, I noticed that I could get attention if I wore something shorter. And I noticed that the high school boys would like comment or that they liked that. So I felt this like constant push and pull between this is bad and sinful, but also this is getting me male validation and attention. And so it was like this constant back and forth between those two things. And I think that the church also has really confusing messaging around all of that, because on one hand, it's a sin to show your body, but on the other hand, you know, put some lipstick on, as an apostle said in 2012, I think it was, to a group of young adults. So it's like, okay, well, then where's that line? And if you don't understand the line, then you always feel like you're doing something wrong on either end of it.
Yeah, it's like modest is hottest is an oxymoron. You're not supposed to be hot.
Yes.
But, and I mean, I've even had Mormon leaders say, you shouldn't use that phrase because you're not supposed to be hot. So we'd say, modest is prettiest.
Modest is most wholesome and beautiful.
That really does get to the heart of what you're told, you know, be beautiful, be hot, be even sexy, you know, be desirable, but cover your body and never show too much skin, and have, you know, there's like a dress that you should wear that's just shaping your body enough that people can see the outline, but not so much that it's hoary or anything like
distracting. I think this is another reason that the Utah beauty standard is so intense, is because of the messaging around pornography. Because I remember learning that in order to maintain your male partner's fidelity, whether that's actually cheating or looking at pornography, you also have to be sexy, right? And not even just how you look, but also like you have to also have a lot of sex and things like that. Also incredibly problematic. But I think there's this element of, I have to be so beautiful and sexy or else I'm not going to, you have to continually deserve your own partner's attention.
Yeah. I mean, I had the same messages. Like if a woman isn't having sex with her husband, who can really blame him for cheating on her or just watching pornography? You know, these are things where it still is the woman's fault, still putting the ball in her court. If her husband, I always have found it so ironic that we talk about agency so often in the church, and there's this one case in which men lose their agency, and it's sex and women. In every other instance, we have full accountability, and you're accountable for your sins and your consequences. And yet, if a girl is showing too much skin and a man pictures her naked, it's actually her fault because he doesn't have the agency, because he's a man, and men can't control themselves. So why do men get the deference of, you're allowed to not have control of yourself in this one instance?
Yep.
It's so unfair.
Yep. They still find the way to blame women, which they love to do, don't they?
So convenient.
Yep.
I wanted to talk about too the idea of having the church and Christ in your countenance, and how this word countenance gets thrown around a lot within Mormonism, which countenance refers to literally how you appear. And it's not so much, your countenance isn't just your personal quiet relationship with God where you go and pray in your closet like it talks about in the Bible. Your countenance is what others see. It's fundamentally about how others perceive your righteousness. How do you think that doctrine makes us so focused on outside appearances?
Boy, do I have an anecdote for that. Because when I was 14, I bought a bikini with my own money. My mom wouldn't buy it for me, but she said I could if I paid for it. So I bought a bikini. Bikinis are kind of like a toss-up in Mormonism. I would say some Mormons do wear bikinis, but more like edgier Mormons, at least when I was a teenager. I bought the swimsuit. I went out and was at the lake with some friends, and we took photos. Like, doesn't even matter, but very much like fun playing in the lake photos, not like thirst traps or whatever. And one of my friends posted those on their Facebook, and my mom got a call, and the bishop wanted to meet with me. So I go into the bishop's office.
One-on-one, I'm
One-on-one. Yep, just the bishop and I, middle-aged man. As I was sitting down, he said, first of all, that dress you're wearing is too short. The current dress I was wearing as I was sitting down. I remember the exact dress. And then he said, my wife saw photos of you on Facebook wearing a bikini. And here's the important part that I want to emphasize here. He said, I'm really worried about you spiritually, because if you're wearing a bikini, that means that you must not be doing well spiritually. There's obviously a lot of things wrong with that whole scenario, but I remember feeling so outraged as someone who attended church, who was participated in Sunday school and young women's, and who had a very strong testimony, who was giving Sunday school lessons and who was bearing my testimony. And yet all of that didn't mean anything because I was wearing a bikini. And that felt so bizarre to me, to be equating like how I was physically presenting myself with my spirituality. And it's different than like the countenance thing, because that's an issue of modesty, but I still feel like it's really related, because it's like, wait a second, do you not care about all of these other things, all of these other ways I'm proving how spiritual I am and I feel? Because ultimately, appearance trumped all of that. And I think that you can take that and extrapolate it to this idea of like the light of Christ in someone's eyes. It's like, we're still just making it about appearance, and so unnecessarily so, because appearance really doesn't have anything to do with someone's spirituality at all, but it's the easiest thing to like look at and make a judgment by. And so people do it. And the Mormon church, I think, really pushes that, because it's like, oh, if we can get women to want to focus on their appearance more, then let's do it.
Yeah, I think that the doctrine of countenance and the way people look, and saying, have Christ in your face, in your eyes, but then also the doctrine, there's a scripture I heard all the time growing up, which is, be ye therefore perfect, even as thy Father in heaven is perfect. Those two doctrines, those are why we have so much plastic surgery, because be perfect, and the way you show how you're perfect is in your face and in the way you present yourself. And this, I think that's why Mormonism is so spiritually devoid of like nourishment, because externalities of ourselves is something that we often, like you said, we first of all, we can't even control in a lot of ways. And even if we can, control them through plastic surgery and through Botox and, going to workout classes, that still doesn't always speak to how we feel internally about ourselves. And if we even just love ourselves and see value in ourselves. And I think that these two ideas are why, everybody I meet will be like, well, Mormons are so nice and they're so friendly. I think it's just so much about the way you're perceived and nothing about the goodness from within.
Yes, it's so externally focused. And I've thought so much since deconstructing and now reconstructing about the relationship to the body and how that's one of the most important relationships we have is with our own body. Like this is what we've got. We live inside this body. It's our vessel. It's our vehicle. And thinking about how distant so many facets of Mormon doctrine made me feel from my body and made me think of my body as something to like be perceived, to adorn, to perform for other people, as opposed to like, this body is mine and how do I feel inside of it? How is my experience of living within this body? That was never, not once, a consideration in all of my Mormon upbringing. I learned one of the biggest things I learned about my body is a temple and it's sacred, which when you first hear that, you're like, oh, that's nice. Like, that's not a bad message. But that was only used in so much as to tell me to not get piercings and to not get tattoos because you would never put graffiti on the temple, which is also highly ironic when you consider the millions of dollars that they're putting into these lavish temples. It's like, well, actually the temples are like adorned pretty extravagantly if we're going to get literal about this. But I just remember thinking like, I have to protect it, like keep it pure in all of these ways that someone else is telling me. And that never helped me actually experience my body. Like, I feel like a lot of Mormons are really distant from their body and have a lot of work to do in leaving Mormonism at like getting back inside their own body and healing that relationship.
Yeah, I think you just reminded me of when I was leaving the church, how much I realized how crazy it is that as a kid, I was so sexualized, and I could point at a lineup of girls and tell you who was sexy, who wasn't, who was too sexy, who was modest and pretty in the right way. I had so much messaging about sexuality, specifically on my own body, how much clothing I'm supposed to be wearing, where my dress should go, if my shirt is too low cut. And there's so much discussion about that and sexualization of you as a child in Mormonism, and yet no knowledge about sex. You never know really your body part names.
Yeah.
You can't really describe, what's the difference between this and that. It's just a black box of information. And then once you get married, sex, have as many babies as you can. And I think I'd love for you to share what your opinion is on the impact of being so sexualized as a kid and growing up as a teenager, but then knowing nothing and kind of having a gate kept from you about sex.
Yeah, I feel one thing that came to mind before I answer that question is actually, I remember the first time I had sex with my husband because we waited till our wedding day. And I remember thinking, why was I so worried about like having a flat stomach? Like that didn't impact this experience whatsoever. But actually in kind of a nice way, in this way of like, I knew so little about sex and I was never taught really to view sex as like a pleasurable experience for myself. I was only ever taught to think of sex as like how I showed up to it and how I looked. And I remember after actually experiencing sex for the first time being like, it doesn't matter if I'm like super, super skinny. It doesn't, like, those things felt so much less important than I feel like I had been made to think they were, because the sexualization as you grow up Mormon is so much about like what you look like and how you appear. But that said, I actually had a very, very turbulent relationship with sex because I had something that I later found out was vaginismus. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
And I think it's fairly common in like highly like purity culture religions, but basically I had extreme pain with sex and I just thought that was normal too. And I remember I would like kind of talk to people about it. And there's also these narratives of like, well, it just hurts anyway. Like you have to get used to it. So I kind of just thought like, I guess this just is what it is. I didn't feel comfortable like really standing in like, no, this hurts. And it wasn't until actually after having my twin girls. So, I mean, I lived for like 5 years experiencing like pretty significant pain with sex before I finally went to a pelvic floor physical therapist and was able to resolve the issue with like proper information and education and physical therapy within like 6 weeks. Wow. But I thought that sex was painful. And like, that's just kind of what I was like, yeah, I think that I've heard that. And that's just an example of that gatekeeping of like, okay, we're talking so much about sex in one way, but we're not making sure that like women have a safe and pleasurable experience. That's like the least important priority, is just very, very bizarre.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. I think it really speaks to, you know, the kind of understanding that sex is for men, and there's the stereotype that men don't need anyone to teach them how to have sex. So like they're good. So where's the problem? And I had a friend actually who had the same thing.
I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Now that
it's
you
a
asked,
hard word to say.
I think it's vaginismus is how you say it.
I had a friend who had vaginismus as well, and she kind of, you know, crying talked to me about how it felt like she was being stabbed between her legs. And that her husband, who is also just has no idea about any of this because he also hasn't been educated, they're just kind of trying to make it work. And she also finally, after about 2 years, saw a special doctor that helped her. But how crazy is it that, you know, years, 5 years, 2 years, you know, and you're taught, you know, sex isn't for women. It's not for pleasure. It's for procreation. It's supposed to hurt anyways. Women don't ever like sex, so don't expect to. These are the messages that I received in my culture of Mormonism.
Yeah.
And when those are the messages you receive, and it's all about being beautiful, you know, it's all about how you look on the outside. You don't expect happiness for yourself, really.
Yep.
You're expecting that to be of value to my community, I need to be beautiful, and that when I experience pain in sex, or if I'm unhappy in my body because I don't like myself, that's of course you don't.
Yeah.
It's not really about that.
Yeah, it's not. It's kind of
selfish
irrelevant.
It's selfish. You would even put it in terms of your own happiness.
Yes. Well, it's the externality thing where it's like, I was never taught to think of sex as something for me. And we could also get into like, because masturbation was also such a sin. It's like, it was never about me. It was always about a theoretical future partner. When I was a teenage girl, it was still, I was being taught sex through the lens of like your future male partner, also very heteronormative, but it was never about me and like my experience and my pleasure. And I think that that's very connected to beauty standards and appearance, because it's just the external thing and in service of straight men.
So as we consider beauty standards within Utah and Mormon culture, there's also a huge influencer culture here. Also, I should have said at the beginning, thank you to Haley for letting us film in her home today. She lives in Utah. And so how do you think that Mormon influencers feed this feedback loop of the ideal Mormon beauty standard?
They are such a huge part of it. The Mormon influencers are like the role models, I think, for a lot of women, Utah women and women outside of Utah. But I think especially for Utah women, because Utah is also very tight knit. There's an interesting thing with influencer culture where like anyone who's not an influencer is like 1 or 2 connections away from like someone who's probably a decent sized influencer, just because everybody's connected here. And so I think that it just expands the comparison game of now you're not just comparing to your neighbor or the people in your ward, you're comparing to your favorite influencers. And I was thinking about this morning. For example, I have gotten Botox before, and it has been paid for if I say like, this is where I went to get Botox. So when people are looking at influencers and these influencers are not only getting Botox, but also promoting Botox, then they think, oh, I need to get Botox. But what they don't always realize is that a lot of people are getting Botox completely for free. And so not only are influencers, it's not part of the job, but they're probably more motivated to take care of their appearance because they're on camera a lot and that's like a part of the gig. But also they are getting so much easier access to cosmetic procedures, to facials, to whatever it may be. They also have more time and resources oftentimes. And so then not only are you comparing like what you look like, but you're also like, oh, it seems like everyone's just getting Botox. And even though that feels really expensive, if that's what people are doing, then I guess that's what people are doing. I need to find a way to make that work, without realizing that a lot of times that's part of the job, is for them to get cosmetic things done and then promote it.
I feel like when I was at BYU, we weren't quite to the internet culture of influencers yet. So I never quite experienced what it's like to grow up seeing a picture of a woman with 100,000 likes and every comment is, "You look so beautiful." I didn't grow up with that. I mean, I still grew up thinking I should like not eat so much. So I still like, so this added layer of, wow, not only do I have all this kind of subliminal messaging and messaging from my family, but now I see hard data to prove that this certain way of looking is desirable objectively. Do you see in maybe people you know or yourself stories of people who are growing up? Maybe you have like someone younger than you. I don't know if this hit you as much, like for how I'm saying it didn't quite hit me because I was like pre-social media age a little bit. But do you have any stories to share of someone who has been impacted by growing up in a social media age in Utah?
I feel like I was kind of right at the cusp of it. I got Instagram, I want to say when I was a senior in high school.
Okay.
And I think all the time as an almost 30-year-old woman, how absolutely incomprehensible it is to me to have had the added layer of social media and influencing. And even as someone who, I feel like with the kind of content I do, I don't necessarily consider myself an influencer, but I feel like I'm very much like, a lot of my friends are influencers. I'm like very like pretty integrated into that space. And so I kind of have both sides of the coin, where I feel like I was on the internet, like in my college days, I definitely like had influencers I followed, and now kind of being in some capacity, like also on the other side of that coin. I just think so much about how much pressure it is for literally everyone involved, for the people doing it, for the people watching it. And yeah, I don't know what it would have done to my brain to have experienced it any younger than I did. And I also think being someone who is on the internet and like posts photos and posts videos of myself talking on the internet, I am so dedicated to not getting my daughter's social media until at least late teenage years, because like it takes a massive toll on me as a fully brain developed woman as far as appearance goes. And so I want to really at all costs like put that off for as long as I can for my own children.
Yeah, and for anyone listening, I hope that they know it's how damaging, even just knowing that it can be damaging is helpful. And even just having, I used to be a teacher, and even in third grade, kids are already having phones. Some of them already have social media accounts that their parents are letting them have. And I've had little girls who are 8 years old who are saying, "I'm too fat, I'm fat, I'm fat." And, that's not Mormon kids. That's, like we're saying, it's all kind of wrapped into the beauty standard that it just exists at large within the US, within, internet culture generally, when you see that certain people who look certain ways are more desirable, and you see numbers next to them that kind of prove that definitively. And that, I think, is so difficult, especially when a lot of these kids or, teenagers or even adults don't even have the financial means to kind of get there. And a lot of the people who are influencers are maybe getting it for free or buying something and then returning it. And so it's kind of this mirage that is not able to be reached by anyone, really. Yes. Especially with, now Facetune and body tuning, and, it really is just creating a true 100% fantasy that isn't even reachable by any human on planet Earth, because we are digitizing somebody that doesn't even exist.
Yeah, it's not even real. Like you can't even be sure that that's like what their actual face looks like. Yeah, it is really intense. And I'd like to think I really do like TikTok more for that reason, because I do feel like hopefully more and more and more the type of content we're consuming and like the people that we're like lending our time on the internet is not based on their appearance at all, but is based on like what they can teach us and what we can learn from them. And I do feel like that's happening more, at least on certain platforms, maybe more than others. But still, like, I think about this all the time talking about Mormon stuff. I'm like, I certainly am going to be received very differently talking about controversial issues because I'm relatively thin and white. And if I was a Black woman, the response to the same thoughts that I'm sharing would be massively different and probably much more hostile just because of beauty standards, and just thinking about like, even with hopefully, with making content and putting things on the internet, hopefully more and more, it's less about appearance, but still appearance is just like part of it. Like you're still seeing someone when they're talking,
Yeah, I think I think about this a lot when it comes to the question of, what is kind of the feminist way to do this? What's the moral way to make content that people see and to have your face on the internet? And there's a huge push and pull between is getting a boob job or Botox or any number of these procedures. In some ways, it is I think in some ways, and many people do consider it to be a feminist act to reclaim, my body is mine. I get to choose. If I want to do X, Y, Z, I get to choose. It's the body autonomy feminism that is almost used as a way to say, here's why it's okay for me to do this. And then others would say, well, it's still just serving this greater patriarchal system that says being beautiful is the only way to be valuable. So I think there's this huge chasm that so many women, unfortunately, it's put on us to kind of feel like we have to make a moral stand either way, when this is not even something that is revolving in the minds of men at all. And even to moralize it to begin with, I kind of have a problem with, purely because why do Mormons and even ex-Mormons feel the need to moralize every choice ever made by specifically and especially by women?
Yeah.
But where do you fall, and how do you feel about that huge push and pull?
Yeah. I mean, I do think about it, and I think I'm glad you said that, because the last thing I want to do, or the way I want to come off, is like influencers are the problem. I feel like I kind of had a phase where I was like, well, it's these women's fault. These women are putting their beautiful faces and their beautiful lives on the internet, and that's creating all this comparison. And I don't blame them really at all. I think that there is so much larger things at play here. And I feel like where I'm at now, and I actually am like back and forth on this all the time. I think that, let's say getting Botox, for example, I don't think that it's inherently feminist to get Botox, but I also don't think that it's anti-feminist to get Botox. I think that it just is. And I can totally understand people having a different approach and being like, no, like, I'm not going to get Botox. I'm not going to wear makeup, whatever. And I think that's great. And I think that probably does good things for moving feminism forward. But I also think that it puts an unfair burden on the women who didn't create the system to begin with, and who are part of it, and who are just trying to get by and who are thinking about these things. And I think that's part of how I feel with like influencers too. And I mean, that's such a broad term in and of itself, but a lot of these influencers are incredibly smart business women who are strategic, who are creative directors and business managers, and all these things wrapped into one. And then they're on the internet and people are commenting about their wrinkles on their forehead. And maybe that gets annoying, and it's like, whatever, I'm just going to get Botox, or maybe they just do it for themselves, or maybe they don't do it. But I just think putting that much of the attention onto a single woman is really detrimental. And I think it happens a lot. I found myself doing this too. And I feel like this is such a hot button issue, but Ballerina Farm. Mm-hmm. And don't get me wrong. I think there's a time and a place to like call out someone like Hannah Nealman of Ballerina Farm because she's so connected to like these greater messages. And she was on the cover of a magazine that's like very regressive in a lot of ways. Like, I'm not saying off limits, but I'm also saying like, I don't think Hannah Nealman is the problem, but sometimes I myself have found myself like treating her like she is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of like making individuals the proxy for a problem is so easy, and saying she represents why this thing is happening is so easy because you can assign a face to an issue, when really criticizing systems is much more difficult and much more difficult to get buy-in. You know, if I say Nara Smith, ding, 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 suddenly everyone has kind of a parasocial opinion and a relationship with her. Whereas if I say, you know, even just if I take it a step back and say trad wives without even mentioning their names, suddenly I get fewer views on my argument.
Yep.
And I think by using people as evidence of criticism, it's like easier for people to hate a specific person, and especially I think if it's a woman.
Absolutely. This, not in any big way, but I got a boob job month and a half ago, and I kind of found myself a bit unexpectedly in the center of a conversation around gender affirming care, and whether or not cisgender women getting boob jobs is considered gender affirming care. And it was really interesting because people were talking about gender affirming care, but they were also talking about not only my body, but also my boobs, like a very intimate part of my body. And I also, I spoke about it on the internet. Like I opened up that conversation. And also it was very eye-opening thinking about transgender people and how their bodies are constantly politicized, and how like the whole experience of being a transgender person is like almost inherently political in a way that's massively unfair. So it was eye-opening in a way, but it was also kind of, to your point, it was really interesting to think about like people aren't really talking about me, but yet they are talking about me, and they're talking about my boobs and the size of my boobs, and just like how scary that is and how unfair that it felt in a way. But yeah, I guess just to your point, like it's just our brains can wrap around that easier when we're talking about a specific person that like you can look at and see their face and see their life. It's so much more engaging than being like, let's talk about this issue in this system.
Yeah, I think as humans, we're just hardwired to care more if it's about somebody, about a person that we've seen and we know their face, versus this broad, amorphous, nebulous idea that's floating out in space somewhere that we want to criticize, but we don't really even know how to get at it, versus typing a comment in their comment section. And I also think that there's the question of, if you're part of a system, how do you exist in the system while also criticizing it and rejecting it? And I think that that's how I feel about beauty, because ultimately, when I wear makeup and put on nice clothing and do my hair and get Botox, which I also get Botox, I didn't before I started having internet fame, I guess.
Yeah.
I started getting it maybe 6 months into this whole follower thing or subscriber thing. And I feel like, to me, it's a way to weaponize my beauty in a way that gets people to listen to me. And if more people listen to me because I look nice, I will look nice because I think it is a feminist act to serve the greater good of the message. But I do still, as I'm sitting in the chair getting needles shoved into my forehead, and I'm sure there will be many comments of people saying like, neither of you need to do that, we would listen anyways. The thing is, I'm not sure that actually is the case. We, just like we're hardwired to choose a specific person to pin all of our dislikes on and say this is the reason for our problems, we're also hardwired to listen to people more when we like how they look. Taller men make more money. Skinny women make more money. These are just statistically true, and they're unfair. But do you go with the system and weaponize it to accomplish a greater good? Or do you opt out of the system and almost relinquish some of the power you might have had by using the system in a way to get what you're going for?
Yes. And does it being unfair make it untrue? No, which again is why I think like demonizing the women who get the Botox feels misguided to me. I also think around like Botox and my boob job, and this is tricky, and I'm curious what you think. I'm welcoming pushback. But I do think there's something to be said for like me editing my videos, because I talk to the camera for my job and I edit my own shit, and like me getting like noticing my forehead and feeling like I just am thinking about my forehead. And then I get Botox and I just like don't notice it anymore. And it almost kind of like takes away a certain amount of like energy that I was spending. Like, and obviously I know the right answer is like, it doesn't fucking matter. And I get that rationally, but I also live in a system where I know that people notice it and I notice it. And part of me deciding to get my boob job was like, I was really not even fixated, but I thought a lot about, I felt very flat chested, and I spent a lot of time and energy thinking about it. And it made me feel sad. It made me feel uncomfortable in my body. And now that I have implants and it's been like 6 weeks, it's almost like it took some of that like attention on my body almost away in a sense. And again, I know that that's all very much existing in a system that makes me want to feel all of those ways. And that's why I'm thinking about feeling flat chested in the first place. But if I'm being completely candid here, like in some ways I can see certain cosmetic procedures or plastic surgery procedures as freeing women up from like being so fixated on something. I think there's a really interesting conversation right now around Ozempic in a similar vein. And Ozempic's different because there's also a lot of like medical reasons, etc. But if someone is like really, really, really wanting to lose weight and they have a way that they can do that through Ozempic in a way that they couldn't before, maybe that's freeing them up, their mental energy up in other ways. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of why I love The Substance. Have you seen that?
I cannot do body horror. So I have listened to like, no. I've read the whole synopsis and I've listened to like multiple recaps, and I might just watch it at this point, but
you need clear play.
I know. Honestly, I'm like, someone edit this for me.
Yeah. I think what I took from that movie, one of the things is how we rob future us for current us. And I think some like Ozempic kind of reminds me of that. You know, if you have health impacts from Ozempic, you probably won't face them for maybe 20 or 30 years. But if it takes a decade off your life, like we still don't really know, I don't think. It just like makes your heart beat 10 times faster or whatever. And the people who use a lot of Ozempic don't really look particularly healthy. They look a little deflated. But yeah, I think a lot of beauty and a lot of, you know, it feels almost like me now will be happier, but I'm just pushing the dissatisfaction of aging or of eating, or, you know, it's like I'm just pushing it from my mind far enough away that I'm not thinking about it as much, which is actually really nice to do. And,
yeah, that's a good point though. It's not ultimately, it's not the root problem. And I think that that's like an important thing to understand is like, yeah, even back to my boobs, like, is it solving the actual root problem at like the core of like why I felt like I wanted to not be flat chested? No, like getting implants isn't solving that root problem. So using like cosmetic procedures and all of these things without also like doing therapy and addressing like the roots of these things, I think to your point is ultimately just kind of like delaying the inevitable probably.
Yeah, I would love for if you were to say, okay, moving forward, Haley has control of the Utah Mormon world beauty, you know, what would you hope would change, or what would you change about the culture here to be, you know, maybe not perfect, but what are some things you would change to be healthier?
Oh man, where to begin? I think this maybe is kind of a cop-out answer because it's not very specific, but I think just shifting the focus, to your point, like away from appearance, it's something so natural that we do, especially as women. Like, we've done it since we were teenagers of like, you look so pretty. And we think that that's the nicest thing we can say to someone. And then it kind of becomes the nicest thing we can say to someone. And then we keep doing it. Mm-hmm. But then it's funny, even me saying that is I'm like, well, if I posted a photo of myself and no one said I looked beautiful, then I would be like, wait, but am I, or is something wrong? Like, it's so baked in that I feel like the first step I could see to like improving all of this is just shifting focus away from physical appearance and toward ideas and opinions and contributions that don't have anything to do with physical appearance. And I think were that to happen, if that could happen, then a lot of those other things would sort of like at least get a lot quieter, if not entirely melt away.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I liked your point between the difference between Instagram and TikTok, and how with the picture-centric social media, the picture is what you see, and that's kind of, you know, there's not a lot of idea behind a picture potentially, you know, it's maybe just how someone looks. That's what you're seeing. And TikTok is still, you know, lots of thirst traps on TikTok.
Yeah, there's definitely plenty of that.
But it is more so, I think, about crafting a narrative or a comedy sketch or an idea. And of course, I think you probably still do well on TikTok if you're pretty, or if you're handsome or hot or whatever. That's still just going to be, you know, pretty privilege is kind of an internet fact. I do think that hopefully as, you know, platforms like that exist, we see hopefully a rise. You know, I feel like even for my videos, it's like, it's really nice that people are listening to what I'm saying, mm-hmm. and the words I'm saying, and most of the comments are engaging with what I'm saying. Yeah. And they're not about what you look like.
I think about that being a podcaster, and I have a video element. I post reels and TikToks, and I post on YouTube. But my primary thing is an audio experience. And I feel so honored in like a different way that like people just want to hear what I'm saying. That feels like, wow, that's really cool. That like people want to hear what I have to say, completely separate from any sort of appearance thing. And I do really think that enough people are feeling this same thing that we've talked about, and enough people are kind of like waking up to it and feeling like this is a waste of everyone's time and energy, that I hope, I mean, I think beauty, it's not like beauty standards are going to crumble anytime soon, but I do hope that there's increased pushback where more and more people are kind of like, nah. And I think we're seeing that in small ways, even like Pamela
Anderson.
Anderson, thank you. She's been doing like events and red carpets without wearing makeup. And sad that that's radical. It's kind of radical though. And like, that's kind of a big deal in that space. And I just hope we see more and more of that, especially as the online economy is more so, I think, increasingly favoring people who have interesting things to say.
You're an ex-Mormon. You've been out of the church for a while. I'm curious if you saw a difference in the backlash you received about your boob job from Mormon people versus ex-Mormon people. And I'm sure you receive criticism because everyone loves to criticize if anyone does anything to their bodies, you know, as we've established. I'm curious if there was criticism from both, and if there was, then what was the difference in the criticism from different groups of people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny, I had not realized the only criticism I got from an active Mormon about the boob job was a man who said, you're getting all this plastic surgery and yet you haven't taken care of your nose and your mole. Which I'm like, you're crazy. Because I love my nose and I love my mole. But that was the only critical feedback. And I like usually once my comment sections get to a certain place, I say they're in the universe's hands now, none of my business. But I don't think I got any active Mormon criticism beyond that. And I feel like,
which I will say, just to comment, I
Yeah,
feel like
please.
the fact that a man is saying, hey, you got 5 of the 6,
Yep.
but you didn't get 6,
Yeah.
is literally what we've been talking about, that the only criticism is from a man saying, you're still not there
Yeah.
yet. Like, that's so crazy.
yeah, it wasn't even criticizing the boob job. It was like, okay, well, keep going. Like, you're not quite my whatever. And he was, anyway, I posted a photo of him on my Instagram page. There's a wall of shame highlight I just started. So if you want to see him, you are welcome to go look at his face. But I actually feel like the pushback I got from ex-Mormons, like from people who I think actually like engage with my page and know who I am, was around me speaking about like feminist topics and talking about things like this and then getting a boob job. And I expected that 100%. And I actually am like kind of in a weird way, like proud of myself because I did something knowing that it was very complicated and that it would warrant not only pushback, but also valid pushback. Like I understand the pushback and I think that it's valid. Like we've talked about all the reasons why it's valid. And yet it was still something I chose to do. And I also hopefully have a decent amount of self-awareness around like all of these things that we've spoken about. And I think that there's kind of something about that makes me feel like I don't have to be perfect to still, I'm wading through all of this same stuff. And I'm actually really happy with my decision. I wouldn't have done it differently. But I do think that it is interesting to note, to your question, Mormons didn't seem to care about the boob job.
Except for the men who said, keep going.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting.
The Mormons were like, yes, she's going to come back to church. She got a boob job.
You see, your countenance changed.
The light of Christ is in your eyes.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I kind of wondered if there'd be, and not like you could always tell from a commenter who's active and who's not.
Often you can.
Yeah, whenever I was driving to your house, my Uber driver mentioned the LDS church, and I was like, it's so interesting they've created this mechanism so that you can always tell who's active and who's not just by how they say the name of the church.
Oh, so true.
It's like another externality that's just like, I can tell what team you're on just by how you characterize your membership within the church.
And you know what? I don't know if I can use the word code switch, but I do that. When I'm around Mormons, I start saying LDS. I'm like, what? Like without even noticing it. I'm like, wait, I always just say Mormons. Why am I saying LDS now? So
or just the church.
Yeah, the church. Yeah, that's always a safe one.
Member of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a person who's kind of well known, and she talked about being a member, and she was like, well, some people call us Mormon, but I'm LDS. And I was like, wow, so she's really Mormon.
Yep. Okay, I believe her.
It's such a canned line, but it's just so interesting how these mechanisms arise to figure out the in group and the out group.
Yeah,
that's a huge reason why I got my nose ring. Was I look very Mormon, and I wanted something on my billboard to say I'm not active. And I was out of the church for maybe 4 or 5 years, and I was at a wedding, so I was at a church building, and this man in a suit walked past me, and he was like, "Hi, sister," and I was like, I still look Mormon.
You ran straight to the piercing parlor.
Yeah, and I feel like almost I have to reclaim my image, not just from my past in the church, but also for my DNA is so genetically Scandinavian Mormon.
One more thought on the boob job thing. The biggest personal wrestle I had with it was how Mormon it is. Like plastic surgery, especially boob jobs, is just a very Mormon thing to do. And I remember telling Bentley, I'm like, I really think I want to do this. I thought about it for such a long time. And I was like, oh God, like this is so Mormon. And I think that, there's always kind of, you actually talked about this in your book, and I really loved what you talked about. You talked about it in reference to motherhood and how, yes, we can, just following the Mormon church is its own like cage, but also needing to rebel can also be its own cage. There's a good Glennon Doyle quote about that, but it is always a funny thing to be like, is this choice a Mormon choice or a rebellion from Mormonism choice, or maybe just like actually a choice that I'm making. It's hard to discern.
Sometimes I'll think, oh, I'm making this choice just because I want it, because in a vacuum, this is who I am. And then a few years down the line, I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure that was kind of a reactionary choice from me wanting to, like I said earlier, like cut off every part of myself that was Mormon. It's like I'm doing the opposite instead of doing something that's me.
Yep.
And that pendulum swing is so hard to kind of get out of, because you were not raised in a vacuum. You're just a product of your life. So how do you meet out like the real me versus the ex-Mormon versus the Mormon me? And I think that's a lot of the book, is trying to just experiment with many different options and not tie yourself too closely to anything, and just say, I'm on a journey here.
Yes. And it gives one of the gifts of leaving a high demand religion like Mormonism is that, to a fault, certainly, but we do have a very high level of self-awareness, I think. Like, we consider our decisions, so because we're considering that, is this Mormon, is this not, is this me? And I think that self-awareness can be a huge gift too, because it leads to, if you're able to like detach shame and guilt from if it was Mormon you or ex-Mormon you or whatever, it leads to a lot of self-reflection, and I think a lot of self-exploration that I think without the Mormon stuff, I maybe just like wouldn't have really thought all that much about it, which would be nice. In a lot of instances, it would be nice. But a lot of times I'm like, no, I'm glad that I'm like, it's kind of even just exciting to just think about like, okay, what's really in there? And it gives you kind of a lens to like really self-explore through.
Yeah, it means you're really conscious about the choices you make. And you're really... I think it's a good muscle to start to flex of, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because my bishop? Am I doing this because my dad? Am I doing this because the scriptures? And then it's like, am I doing this because I was Mormon and now I'm angry and I want to do the opposite? Or am I doing this because, I think that's really part of starting to exercise the muscle of making your own choices, is finally realizing, in the past, I didn't really consciously make choices. I followed a path. And now I'm having to learn where my choices are originating from and if they're good to follow through on.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for coming on my channel today.
I loved this.
I'm going to link, as I said, I'm going to link Girls Camp below, Haley's profiles if you want to follow Girls Camp. I love the Girls Camp podcast. There's so much amazing wisdom in there with her guests and everything Haley shares. So check that out below. And as always, I will see you all next week.
Bye.